Good morning, everyone, and welcome to ascendLIVE. Super excited to see you this week. Happy Women's History Month, and in honor of celebrating amazing women in marketing this month, today on Ascend, I'm excited to have a chat with Mrs. Davianne Harris of Oberland, a classmate of mine from Penn, and a marketer that I've admired from afar for way too long. So I'm very excited to have this chat with you. Welcome, Davianne.
Thank you, Lola. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So I think, as you know, we've chatted a bit, but for everybody here who might be watching for the first time, Ascend is a show where we're all about inspiring marketers to become our highest professional selves by discussing key topics. And today, we're going to talk purpose-driven marketing, which what could be more of a pertinent topic at this moment? I wanted to start by saying how devastating it was to hear the news about the latest, racially driven shooting in, was it in Atlanta, I believe. And so, I know that's something that is on everyone's mind, and I wanted us to start by acknowledging that as we have this discussion. How are you feeling about it?
It's honestly devastating. I mean, and I know they're still trying to connect the dots between the other set of shootings that has happened. But it's just so, when you see these headlines, and it's terrible in and of itself, but then when you layer in the hate that is clearly behind it or most likely driving it, it's just so devastating on a different level. And honestly, a lot of the work that we do as marketers and this conversation around purpose, we often get lost in the work, right? And, in budgets and creative and deadlines. And honestly, it's times like these where we do take, or at least for myself, take a step back and really understand the gravity of understanding how and really leaning into the issues at hand that are just so front of mind for so many people. And as a society, how much work needs to be done and how much work and effort that can really rely on brands, right? And what actions that they can take, whether it's standing up for communities of color, our Asian brothers and sisters that are at the forefront of a lot of these horrific crimes and treatment. And so I think, this is where we take that pause and really just, lean into these issues and try to help our clients really see how they can take a step forward in trying to dismantle so much of this hatred and these other issues that are happening.
I agree. I mean, and it's, I'm glad that you mentioned that notion of stepping back, because I think, a lot of the discussion that we see, even on a place like LinkedIn, right? That's where a lot of people are watching today, around the role brands are playing in these discussions is make sure you're not being performative, like if you, any action that's not highly substantive is sort of critiqued as not enough. But in a moment like this, it also, to your point, reminds me to implore all of us who are those critics to come from a place of any action is better than no action at all. And I loved how the Oberland purpose forecast kind of ended with that, like silence is not okay. So we'll get into all of that. But first, let's start with just hearing more, Davianne, and I'm excited to hear the deets. I know a bit about your journey to this point as a marketer. Walk us through what brought you to Oberland and the work you do today around purpose.
Sure. And, I wish I could say in some ways that I follow this clear path to where I am now. But honestly, I feel like I wouldn't be here without some of that meandering earlier on. But I think that the through line for me, it was always very passionate and interested in this intersection between consumers, culture, and companies that I feel like hadn't fully been recognized at the time when I was, coming out of school, and I started in market research and then working in agencies on the planning side. But I felt that brands were really only scratching the surface as it pertains to speaking language that resonated with people and their values as humans, not just consumers. And so that's
who we are at the end of the day.
Exactly. Right. And you had lifestyle branding, right? Apple was notorious for really defining that in so many ways, and many brands following in terms of, the brands and products that you aligned with, saying something about who you are and your values in ways. But, as we kind of saw this rise in cause marketing and CSR, corporate social responsibility, entering large brands and corporations, we saw kind of purpose creeping in to organizations and brands, but it was still very siloed. It was a CSR team or an initiative, right? Or a commitment to donating or specific causes or charities that an organization would engage in, as opposed to really thinking about how purpose could drive their brand forward and their marketing efforts. And so,
almost like a tangential sort of like, let's do this to appease everyone, but is it interwoven? And Natalia says, love that value of humans versus just consumers. Thank you, Natalia.
Yes, thank you. And exactly, that's exactly it. And for me personally, it wasn't until my work at Cassandra, the last consultancy I was at, where it was all about studying and understanding youth and younger consumers. At the time, millennials and Gen Zs were our focal points, less so in terms of marketing to youth, but really understanding the drivers and kind of setters of culture and trends in order to future-proof brands. But what everything really came back to was this idea of purpose in some shape or form. And it wasn't about, charitable giving or even activism, but, just this general idea of brands needing to challenge consumers in the world and themselves to do better. And youth really driving that forward and wanting that for themselves in terms of seeing and being part of this real change that was kind of on the horizon. And of course, this is pre-2020, where we can get into that. But that was really kind of the theme. And so when Oberland approached me and we had conversations, it just all fell into place where I could come to a place and really shape something, from a strategic perspective in terms of what purpose really means for brands, and particularly in the for-profit space. We have nonprofit clients, but it's a little easier in ways for a nonprofit to say or kind of understand what their purpose is. For them, it's more about shaping and kind of honing in on, what we want to activate for fundraising, donors, et cetera. But for a for-profit brand, it can be much more challenging, as we know. And as you talked about, that kind of idea of how do you avoid the being performative or being called out for your prior actions, which we're definitely seeing much more of now, and kind of being able to move past that in a way that, acknowledges the kind of prior missteps, but also, kind of eliminates the desire or maybe, just the comfort level of staying silent.
Absolutely. I mean, and I love the idea of, in this new economy, like, I know Oberland's been around since 2014, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it seems so perfectly timed to have a full service agency that does have this expertise and specialization in purpose. It's like, it's 2 for 1. And I think that's one of the things that makes me such a passionate follower of everything that you all are doing. So let's kind of give folks who may feel like this idea of purpose feels vague. Like, if we look up the word purpose in the dictionary, the definition is a bit different than what we mean when we say purpose, and related to marketing and brands. Mm-hmm. How do you, Davianne, define what purpose-driven marketing really is?
So I'll say a couple things, because I think, before we get into what purpose-driven marketing is and, where brands, I think, kind of end up in these pitfalls, if you will, it's that they're not looking at it holistically. They're thinking about it as a one-off or a campaign or that they need to shift their entire business model to be around a giant issue that they want to tackle. And it doesn't have to be any of that. Yes, it can be all of that, but it's the most purpose-driven or truly purpose-driven organizations are really embracing purpose from the bottom up, from the inside out, right? It's starting with who they are as an organization, their values, and not the ones that are, on their website or on the wall, but the ones that they really live and, guide their company and move forward in terms of policies and whatnot. And it infiltrates everything, right? It's not just left for the marketing team or the agency to come up with an idea that they can put forth in Black History Month or Women's History Month or Pride Month or what have you. But it's really finding, and this gets into the second point of it not having to be so big, finding that niche or that area where your brand or product could fit into a really relevant conversation. That's important. So I think that's the other piece of that I try to, is have those conversations with clients and brands who feel it's too, just so big, right? It's not about trying to solve every problem in society, but how can you as a brand in your space make some kind of difference? How can you chip away, right, at the systemic inequities, for instance, in education or healthcare? And it's those chips that will add up to larger change, but it's not about, one brand solving it all.
Right.
So
that wouldn't be possible.
Exactly. And that, as you brought up the purpose forecast, that's what we try to do in terms of giving some kind of some structure and frameworks for how to think about purpose, which I can speak to in a second, but also some tangible examples of how kind of that specificity can happen. So Airbnb is an example I like to reference because what they did with Project Lighthouse was actually based on the insight that there were many people of color looking to rent properties who were getting rejected for various reasons. And looking at the data and algorithms, they realized there were built-in biases, sometimes implicit, obviously, sometimes clearly intentional, from hosts potentially that were, if they saw a profile picture of someone of color, they might not accept them. And so
sorry to cut in, but one of our mutual friends, Jackie, and I and a group were literally experiencing this just last summer.
Wow.
Like, continuously finding, we were looking for a Hamptons house just for like a little socially distanced moment. And it would be, waiting to get approved from the host and then hearing, oh, sorry, we're actually booked that week. Oh, sorry. And it just happened so many times that we couldn't help but think, is there something else going on here? I remember actually tweeting them last summer, like asking that question. So yes, when I read your coverage of Project Lighthouse, I was inspired and hopeful that they're addressing a real systemic issue.
Absolutely. Well, and the test that they did too was kind of similar to kind of the homeowners, where you have the white homeowner or prospective homeowner going in and asking and inquiring about a home, and the same home that a Black family was told was already rented or sold, the white family was offered, right, to look at it. And so, kind of similarly, Airbnb was able to see that where in your case, there would have been a white renter, prospective renter, who would have gotten the house, whereas they turned you down. And so their work and investment is designed to combat that. And so I think that's one way where, are they solving systemic racism? No. But is that a specific issue in a specific area of what they do that they can address, and in a way that isn't, without risk, let's just say, or investment? Because that's part of the framework is we looked at investment and impact and kind of put, low to high impact and investment. impact? Is it, something that's going to have a large impact on others, on society, et cetera, versus slow? And then investment, is there, yes, financial, but is there risk involved? Is this just something where you're making a statement and, it's pretty innocuous, you're not going to upset stakeholders or shareholders or anyone else, ruffle feathers potentially, versus would you possibly lose hosts who feel like, they don't want to be subject to not choosing or selecting, people to stay in their properties, perhaps, right? So, and there's many other examples, right, where there's, even higher risk investment, which we kind of explore. But that's where, to your question about how do you kind of make it more tangible.
Yes.
That's where, we're trying to introduce these, again, frameworks so that it doesn't just feel so amorphous of, okay, sure, purpose sounds great, sign me up, but what does it actually mean?
I love that, because I don't think we're used to hearing the word investment discussed in terms of, are you investing in potential risk? Like, are you willing to be scrutinized in a way that may end up driving, an initial loss? It's especially interesting to me because I think, as we talked about, as we've been connecting over the last couple of weeks, one of the things I'm doing with BCO is inspiring brand leaders to make these purpose-driven moves. Like, my vision is a world where people come to me, get inspired, and I send them to you to actually get this work done. And so with Maximize the Movement, we've been talking a lot about how if you can create social impact as a brand in a way that drives your revenue, actually drives a tangible social impact, as we're discussing, and then has a positive impact on your reputation. So RSR, you can be pretty sure that's going to be something that you might call a max move, or, social impact marketing initiative that actually makes a difference. And when I hear you talk about investment, it's very relevant to what I talk about when I talk about reputation. Like, if you are going to actually improve your reputation, Airbnb, then you need to be taking that risk and making that investment, versus what we saw with Uber. What did you think of that one? If you tolerate racism, delete your account. It almost seems exactly like what you just described, right? With like okay, but is there any skin in the game?
Exactly. Low impact, I would say. I don't think anyone, who's racist is going to, necessarily, yes, maybe they might see that and identify themselves personally as a racist and delete Uber if you want to make the stretch there. And that's risky, but I would say not, right? And I think that, and part of it also is kind of that the prior work, which, I was referencing earlier, where your track record matters as well, right? Like, if they had said that and had been doing things or acting in a way where, they were really coming out in strong support of the Black community and making investments in other places, then, that could just we can move past that. But you're seeing these companies, and the NFL was another one that we call out,
Love that.
Right. And it's not only that they did something wrong, flat out, in terms of how, the treatment of Cap, just the lack of completely acknowledging Black Lives Matter until it was trendy in June, when we saw many other brands doing the same thing. But then to come out with a Super Bowl ad with players kneeling and touting Black Lives Matter and their investment, right? There's just something that really doesn't add up there. Right. And those are the brands too, that it's very problematic, where had they, come out and made a clear statement about where they were wrong, where they had made missteps, and then wanted to talk about an investment and a way forward. I think, clearly not every, there's cancel culture and people are just not going to come back, fine. But you'd have a lot more, people, and generally just respect, when you see a brand who's willing to make those acknowledgements. And I think we need more of that from brands stepping up in that way.
I totally agree. I mean, I'm glad you brought up this topic of cancel culture. As I mentioned to you when we've been chatting, I've been doing a lot of these kind of like pop-in Clubhouse conversations. And this is something that always comes up. And, you know, what I think people need to acknowledge is that this whole idea of cancel culture is a bit of a distraction. What we're really saying, to your point, is you might, as a brand, be called at some point for a conversation based on something that you did. And there is always coming back from that. Like, there's never no coming back from that, but it's about how you handle it, right? Like, it's almost like whether or not you're canceled is on you. So I'm curious, like, have you had any brands come to you at Oberland sort of in the midst of a crisis along these lines, sort of needing your help to course correct?
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing on cancel culture, and I can't remember if you said this or I heard this somewhere else, but I do want to call it out regardless, that, you know, it's the idea that it's not cancel culture, but accountability, because I think there's a difference, right? There is the cancel culture that's just, you know, unrelenting, and a brand, you know, makes a misstep and then everyone comes on, and, you know, no matter what they say or do, it's just, you know, they're never coming back from it in the minds of, you know, some people. But there's also the holding brands accountable and individuals accountable for their actions. But in my mind, if they make those steps forward and adjust and pivot, then, you know, I think there should be some grace in that way. But in terms of, for Oberland, speaking of Uber, we did actually work with Uber after that, but specifically on their sexual. Yes.
You guys, I included my app, Uber. We talk a lot about this, but I still love you.
Yeah, well, I know, right? Don't we all? But it was specifically around sexual assault prevention. So it was less of a let's, you know, because we do have those conversations definitely around, okay, what brands are we not going to work with? And that's, you know, part of being a purpose-driven agency and having those challenging conversations, no matter how much money or glitz might come with it, we have to have some barriers and whatnot. So if Uber came to us saying, we just want to cover this up or help us, you know, create this purpose-driven campaign so that we can distract away. But it was very specific to sexual assault prevention, working with an organization called No More, a nonprofit, where we created a series of campaigns targeting college students and college campuses, but more on the bystander front. So understanding that in many cases where there's a sexual assault, there's someone who sees something that's off, whether it's in a bar or somewhere where you notice someone that's, you know, getting too close and there's, you know, resistance, not always, of course, but there is that component. And so this campaign was specifically targeting bystanders as kind of not standing by and really, you know, trying to get people involved in situations where there could potentially be, you know, an assault or a situation where someone was, you know, getting involved in something they did not want to.
So interesting. And I love that it really speaks to what you mentioned earlier around the initiative being something that is relevant to the product and offering. I feel like, you know, it's almost meta, you can always, I love Oberland's work because it's so thoughtful. And your perspective, I know that's what you're bringing to the table there. Like, a bystander is often the one that helps you call the Uber, right? Like, that's the role of the collective in taking care of each other in these moments where we become vulnerable. It just really takes that to another level. That's so interesting. How did you get to that idea?
So a lot of research, you know, with college students and the like, to understand kind of, you know, we could have taken it just a very straightforward approach of, okay, like call an Uber as opposed to walking home and targeting kind of the potential victim in that case. But it felt done before, right? And in the moment, you don't think that you're, you know, potentially at harm, and it feels like, okay, it's only a block away or a couple blocks, again, you know, focusing on the college campus in this case. And so trying to find, you know, I think, you know, that's something as a team that we're really invested in, and kind of finding that new or different angle or approach or way in that, you know, isn't kind of the straight line. So yeah, and it was very successful. You know, for the year that it ran, we did another secondary campaign on additional college campuses coming off of the first 6 months and kind of test markets. And so it was really just exciting and thoughtful, but just important work. Again, going back to the beginning conversation of where you see things happening, you see these headlines, and it's very upsetting and jarring, but where you feel like you can do something. And again, it's not solving the entire issue, but in some way where you can kind of take the reins and at least chip away, right?
Impact. Yeah. And I love the chip. I'm going to take that with me. Chipping away, like when you're thinking about making an impact, that's a great visual for what it can be. Like an impact can be a chip, but there's got to be a chip. It can't just be like like a caress. It's like you got to chip in there. So one thing I was going to ask you related to this is you mentioned that it was successful. So how did they measure that success? One of the things that I talk about a lot and that I truly believe is that these initiatives are both social impact driving, and that's the most important. But at the end of the day, if you get it right, you're going to see a revenue or, bottom line impact at some regard. So did Uber kind of see that in this segment of college campuses around this campaign?
Yeah. So, and right. That's an interesting question too, just generally about when you get into purpose-driven marketing and what the metrics and KPIs are, right? Because I think that's a misconception where if you're talking about a purpose-driven campaign, it's just a nice thing to do and it's not laddering up to some kind of, it's not always profit or revenue, right? But some kind of positive result. And so in this case, it was both around engagement in terms of the ads themselves, since they were both in person and kind of the out of home, as we call them, and then also digital. So we got really strong, higher than average or much higher than average engagement scores in that regard in the target demographic of college students. And then also we were seeing, it's a little harder to measure in terms of impact of, results from a sexual assault prevention perspective. But we were seeing really strong engagement in terms of people actually staying in and watching the full ad versus clicking away and so forth. And then that allowed us to go into more markets or additional markets based on the really, the strong results there.
I love it. So it's sort of pilot and then expansion because it worked.
Exactly. But we're looking, generally it is that combination of the engagement from, a metrics or an advertising perspective, whatever mediums that we're using. But then also there are, typically are some sort of brand lift. In this case, it wasn't tied specifically to Uber. We weren't necessarily looking to raise the profile, and that I think added to the work. It wasn't the intention or the goal going in was not for it to be about Uber. But that would be another type of metric we could look at in terms of, if a brand is working towards really defining and honing in on their purpose, we should see a lift in NPS, right? Or likelihood to recommend or other metrics like that. So that's where, again, to your point about metrics and kind of putting KPIs against purpose, it's really important for us, both, as we think about the clients and their goals and making sure we're actioning purpose in a way that doesn't feel fluffy, but also where, we're driving this notion that purpose is profitable, right? And value is, really reliant on what a brand stands for and its values. So I think that's even more evident, I think, over the past, 9 months. Unfortunately, just 2020, the myriad events that have happened have kind of elevated purpose in a way that we hadn't necessarily seen before.
Yes. You had some amazing statistics on this in the purpose report. I just popped over to this quickly here, but one of the ones that I really loved, because I hadn't seen anyone tease out an insight in this way, but I believe it was that, let me just see here. You mentioned that, yes, after the murder of George Floyd, 76% of Americans said racial discrimination is a big problem in the United States, a 25-point jump from 2015. Yeah. That's huge. Let's just let that sit for a second. Like, if anyone who thinks things didn't change in 2020, wow. Any thoughts on sort of how that statistic in particular felt really important to include?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it felt important because for two reasons. I think, we've all seen the varying or different response from 2016 and Black Lives Matter in 2020, right? Where you had, and that stat was around consumers and just kind of their own views around, if you look at support for Black Lives Matter, especially of non-Black Americans, it was quite low, right? It was kind of that, it was not trendy to be talking about Black Lives Matter, whereas June 2020, you had to, right, be aligned in some way. And for brands in particular, very, very few spoke out. And that's going back to cancel culture / accountability. L'Oreal, for example, actually fired a model for really speaking out about Black Lives Matter, but then comes back around in June with their statement. So,
and beyond that, it was a trans model, right?
A trans model, yes. One example we use in there, yeah. And so it's interesting, and on many levels, I'm glad, right, that people are coming around, and both on the consumer, just individual side as well as the brand side. But it also, you then also have to take it with a grain of salt when you see some of the responses, and not be surprised where you saw an influx of statements and actions and commitments, June, July, August, sort of, and then pretty much silence from there. And I wrote about that after Black History Month, because I was really, scouring, trying to, just wondering going into February what it was going to look like, what the Super Bowl would look like, right? And what's that?
Was that your Adweek piece recently?
Yeah. And
everybody will link in the comments to all of this content we're mentioning after the show. But that was great.
Yeah, and so it was honestly surprising, because I expected to see just more brands kind of jumping in all of a sudden, even though they hadn't said anything since July, after they made their announcement or Instagram post or their Black Square, what have you. But but I think it was that fear, right? The fear of, okay, if I say something, am I going to be judged or criticized or canceled? And that resulted in a lot of silence. That, going back to the point of being silent, is never the right answer. You might not have the words to say. It's like with anything, like the awkward situation with friends, or something, they're going through something, and you never stay silent, even if you say the wrong thing, or what's not maybe the best thing to say. It's much better than silence. So right. I think for brands, that's where we're seeing even more, just as we talk to consumers and the data we see, and even specifically, we had a data point that 67% feel more negatively towards a brand, or felt more negatively towards a brand who came out in support of the Black community during Black History Month, but failed to otherwise. Right. So you have 2/3 of consumers overall. So this was not just Black consumers who, if you just, did not say anything prior, and then, you came out, then it's problematic. So again, silence is bad, but also, you shouldn't be afraid, or you wouldn't have to be afraid if you had a consistent message, or didn't just pop up when, Black Lives Matter is trending.
Right. I mean, and I think what you're hopefully encouraging everybody who's watching, if you're stewarding a brand, there is nothing more important than to be comfortable with discomfort as a leader, right? Like this idea that the fear and not acting because of the fear is somehow virtuous, it needs to be disrupted. It really is more of a protection of the individual ego. I mean, and in my opinion, and we have a commenter here, I hate the term cancel culture. It's being used way too much. We agree. Find it insulting. We're not using our brains or ethics when we make a decision to discontinue sport. Interesting. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, based on all the reasons we've talked about here, cancel culture is definitely overused. I think, again, where I parse it apart is accountability, and making sure that it's not just this, temper tantrum that we're throwing when a brand says something or does something that we don't like, but it is necessary, and that's where I think the power of social media and our, Gen Z friends who are, on it, right, and scouring and ready to uncover and, dissect comments or claims or what have you. Nike, the newest spot is an example, which I can speak to in a second. But that brand accountability is what, and consumers holding brands accountable is important if we want to move forward. Because if it was up to brands, it would just be about profit, right? We're a capitalistic society. So if profit's going to be driven, and it's easiest if you can just get by and sell your product and keep pushing it out there and not have to make the investment in DEI, right? And purpose and all of the things that we're talking about, which, are hard in a lot of ways, then, they would get by without doing it. So that accountability is what pushes brands to have to say, wait, if I want to be profitable, if I want to break through, then I need to step up and do something.
Yes. And I mean, that's where consumers should feel very empowered to be market makers, right? Like you can decide what way the profitability engine needs to go. And Michelle's chiming in again here. Hi, Michelle. Thank you for joining us. Those opposing cancel culture are usually playing victim and the oppressor. Ooh, interesting. Mic drop moment there. They have never been held accountable for their actions. And well, now we are. So, gosh, this has been such an exciting discussion. We only have about 5 more minutes. I want to hear your thoughts on Nike, as you mentioned. And the kind of last big question I have for you, address maybe as part of that, if possible, is sort of for brand leaders who are struggling to get the internal buy-in to like call up Oberland, get started, come do a Maximize the Movement workshop, hint, hint. What would you advise as to how you've seen your clients successfully create that internal alignment to get the yes and get started?
Yeah. So I'll quickly address Nike and then the second question. So I don't know if you saw the newest Nike spot, the toughest athletes with it's pregnant women. Serena's in there with her daughter, right?
It literally brought tears to my eyes.
It did. Me too. I loved it. And actually, a coworker pointed out or had sent me an Instagram post that one of the athletes that had been let go / it's unclear there was something that happened negatively as a result of her becoming pregnant and her contract with Nike. And so, yes. And so basically pointing out the fact that there were several athletes, including Allison Felix from the Olympic team who had issues and, severed contracts, a woman who was 6 months pregnant and had to basically continue in a race in order to keep her contract with Nike, right? So there's a lot of issues around Nike and pregnant women that had surfaced, I remember, in the past, but definitely in response to an ad that is lifting up in a very powerful, emotional, really well executed way, breastfeeding and pregnant women. But it goes back to this. I know, right? And so it goes back to the fact that, every brand has made mistakes and will continue to. But number one, you have to own them straight on, because it's always better for you to call yourself out than for other people to call you out, right? And
note that, people. Yes.
And two, once you identify, you need to identify that root cause or the systemic nature of why the issue occurred in the first place, before then you fix it. So, and then go out and, add away with these spots and compelling messages. But that's, it was really, it's hard, right? When you see something that is so powerful and uplifting, and forget Nike, but just and I still believe that the spot is very effective in lifting up women that are often seen as myself going as a pregnant woman and being, told, put that down and you're not sure, whatever, all that stuff. So I really related to it in that way. So on its own, great. But, you need to address it. You need to acknowledge it. And that's the problem to me. And this whole idea of accountability for brands is, around that.
Yeah. Missing the investment you talked about, like the real investment, that negatively impacts reputation. And I just have to say, Davianne, like, I really respect the fact that, as head of strategy and partner at Oberland, the company is committed to having these moments of, calling for conversation. A Nike, who is a very influential brand, to me, that's your investment.
Right.
Walk the walk, like being willing to speak truth to power when you are in the client service space. Like, I don't think we see a ton of that, and it's really awesome that you're leading that charge.
I appreciate that. No, definitely. I mean, I think across the board, for brands, in what defines a purpose-driven brand it's the ones that embrace hard, right? It's not a matter of making hard choices. Choices really are often not that difficult because we know what to do. It's what we know what to do is going to take a lot, right? And it's going to be hard and strenuous. There's risk involved. So, I think it's the brands, and this gets into your last question around, for that buy-in. I think, the first thing I would say to anyone, leaders or others that are trying to get that kind of internal buy-in, be honest with yourself, right? About where your organization really is. And what values you operate on. Again, not the ones on the wall in the lobby or on the website, but where your organization really is. And if they're willing to do that hard work. It seems obvious, but really having worked with many organizations that, in the initial calls we have, they love the idea of purpose and DEI and align all of, to all of those principles, right? And they, talk about how their corporate values, match up. But then when you start to peel away at who they really are, what they stand for, what they're motivated by, purpose just isn't a priority for them. And that's huge because we'll spend months trying to rally them around what we know is a really authentic brand purpose and positioning, and have ideas around how that could define how they show up. But there's constantly, excuses and resistance, and they're saying everything without really just saying they want to keep the things the way they are. And so I think, that's one thing, just really having that honest conversation with yourself, with your, leaders or other teams, if you can. And then second, it's going back to the other point about focusing on one thing, right? Because again, when you try to do everything, it becomes too much. And, so really focusing on the, digestible, initially maybe safe changes that won't kind of ruffle the feathers initially, and work up from there. Yeah. And so I think, there's that aspect of it. And then there's also just holistically understanding the connection between internal and external. The last point I'll make, because I think there's so much around, especially now, right? There's DEI programs and initiatives, which is amazing, but they're often tangential, to your point before, kind of in the cause marketing, the way CSR was, to the bottom line of the organization. And until there is a, really core focus on bringing that all together and understanding that the people, the diversity that you have in the room on every team, let's talk about marketing. I mean, in our case, advertising, the people that are writing, producing, creating, if they all look one way, you're going to get one result. And especially if you're trying to communicate and, resonate with an audience that does not look like them, then of course you're going to get an output that, misses the mark, right? Of course, Burger King and the, women belong in the kitchen. I don't know the composition of the team, but I don't know.
Tell everyone about that one quick, because some folks may not have seen it. Oh, Oh, it was, yeah, please. What did do you want to describe what happened there? Just real quick.
Right. So for Women's History Month, Burger King tweeted, women belong in the kitchen as as their way of highlighting and spotlighting female chefs who don't get their due credit. So again, great concept and idea, around that, but horrible execution. And so that right there is proof of, why diversity matters, why having people in the room to represent, the people that you want to speak to say, yeah, that's interesting, but I think we might want to say it a different way because this way is offensive. I'm just not going to.
Please, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, but
no.
It would have been one thing if only female not female. This is another thing I've been discussing, the idea of using the word female versus woman, but women chefs would have seen it. But at the end of the day, anybody who isn't in that paradigm of the male dominated, culinary industry, it wouldn't hit them as hard. I do think, and I saw a couple responses from women chefs who really did feel inspired by that because it's a hurdle, but it's such a small segment. In Burger King, your consumers are the average everyday person who's not in the culinary industry. So it's like we get that it felt so sexy, but then like you didn't think globally. And yes, I think a team of women, with that maybe just having one or two would have had that discussion a little bit more impactfully. Michelle says they obviously didn't hire Wendy's Twitter social media team. And Natalia says here, it's important to have these conversations, address what the issue is or was, and find a forward approach. Acknowledgement is key aside from purpose. This is why I love working with Natalia. Love that. Thank you. Yeah. So much good stuff. Davianne, we're gonna have to have this discussion again because
I know it's too much for 45 minutes or an hour, what have you.
Right?
How much time it is.
We've done so much. I know. Gosh, almost. Okay, I'm gonna get in trouble for going over an hour. Last thing, we want to make sure people know what Oberland resources or content would you like to point the audience to, towards learning more about your work and, potentially even getting support from your team.
Yeah, absolutely. So Oberland, so a couple of recent resources. I know we talked a lot about the purpose forecast, but that is free and available to download on our website. This is oberland.com. And then a new thing that we just launched called the Purpose Tracker is a blog that we continually update with purpose-driven content and advertising, not done by us necessarily, but kind of, anything that we're seeing out there that's somehow related to purpose, whether that's around women's equity and gender equity, racial equity, sustainability, and climate action, really kind of any topic. We do a very brief write-up. We're not analyzing it. So, this is not us vouching for it or saying that it's kind of past the purpose test, if you will, but really just trying to create a space for people to see what's out there. Because, we're always trying to look for examples. Even us internally, it's been helpful just to be able to pull from. So that's something that's also available on our website as a blog. But
awesome. I mean, I will check that out. I'm also tracking sort of case studies that I've been seeing around brands that are making what I call max moves. I might even call them max purpose moves now that I've been in Oberland. So I'm going to check that out and probably pull some links to share on my site as well. So super awesome. Davianne, you're amazing. I love the work you're doing. I love your integrity. It's an honor to be a colleague of yours, a post-classmate of yours, and now a LinkedIn Live friend of yours. So we really appreciate you being here today. And everybody, this is oberland.com. Check it out. As you can see, we have a lot to learn from the work this team is doing. And Davianne, any final words for the audience?
I just want to say thank you so much. These are important conversations that we're, just not having enough, right? Because we're caught up in so many other things. But I think, I truly believe this is more than marketing, more than branding, and to kind of close the loop on the conversation in the beginning. It's essential if we want to see change, if we want to really, drive our society forward, be there for our young people, solve these major systemic inequities and challenges, then these are the conversations we need to have, the accountability, the acknowledgement, all the things that came up. So love what you're doing, Lola, to have these and bring these conversations to the forefront. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Well, okay, everybody. And Drew Train, I agree. Well done, Davianne. This is an awesome conversation. Everybody will be back next week with Sam Lee to talk about community. And Davianne, have a wonderful day. And thank you again. If you're watching the replay, definitely let us know. And we just look forward to seeing you soon here on ascendLIVE. Have a great day, Davianne, and everybody else. Thank you so much.
Everyone, thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody. See you next time.
Bye.